Hello everybody and welcome to your lecture on ocean sediments. Glad you could be with me today. So we're getting started learning about a little bit about ocean sediments, and I know that sounds like maybe a boring subject, but actually I think you'll find it a little bit more interesting than what you might be expecting. So let's get on with the lecture here. But anyway, so first of all, I want to ask this question of what is sediment, right? That's your first question you have on your lecture assignment. So what is sediment? Sediment basically can be a few things. I'm just opening the lecture assignment here so I can look at it along with you. It can consist of a few things, and you'll see there's various types, but basically it's just loose either rock or mineral matter that collects on the ocean floor, and but the main thing is that it's loose pieces of stuff. And I know that sounds very vague, but you'll see why, because a lot of different things can consist of sediment. So, or one of the main things, for example, sediment can consist of broken rock pieces. Okay, so pieces of like rocks and minerals. Like if you were to zoom in with a microscope, you would see that a lot of sand maybe looks something like this. It actually looks like a lot of just mixture of rocks, minerals, things like that, little crystals and things like that are relatively well-rounded often because they've gone through some transportation. But that's not the only thing that sediment can consist of. It can actually also consist of shells of marine organisms. And I know that sounds like a little weird, but actually you're maybe familiar with this if you've ever been to the beaches along the national seashore, the Padre Island National Seashore. You might have been to beaches where the beach sand is entirely made of shells. So, things like that are actually quite common. So I can cut to a little segment here and show you that, just some pictures of some beach sand that's made of shells. Hey everybody, just another little video here I wanted to show you with this camera. Is that, I was mentioning that a lot of sediments are made out of shells, right? So this is actually a rock that is compressed out of the sediments made of shells. So if you take a look at this, and hopefully you can see this properly and closely, this is a rock. It's a sedimentary rock made of sediments that's totally made out of like little clam shells. And just like I was showing you before, I could take a little bit of acid and put it on this rock, and you can hear and see the reaction, right, of that acid with the clamshells in that rock, right? So just another little demonstration for you. Thanks. So anyway, looking at this picture here, you can see that this beach is just a collection of shells, right? Now, and you might have seen things like this around town in Corpus Christi, in the bay. There's oyster reefs, and those oyster shells accumulate, and they can actually create like spits like this. Spits are kind of like these thin, narrow strips of land that go out into the ocean. And what are they made of? They're made entirely out of oyster shells. So you maybe seen things like this before around town. I know that some beaches, like at Indian Point, for example, are made entirely out of shells. Now, a lot of sand that if you were to zoom in with a microscope, you'd actually see a lot of sand is actually made of marine organisms. So a lot of these things are like little sponges, little corals. These are like little pieces of coral here, maybe little shells, things like that, right? You can see these things are little shells. So if you zoom in, you can actually see a lot of the sand. It's not little bits and pieces of rock and mineral. It's actually little bits and pieces of like marine organisms, whether it's coral or clams or gastropods like sea snails, things like that. But organisms that make their shells out of like a mineral like material. Okay, I do want to kind of cut now to a little video and just kind of demonstrate some of this for you so you can have a first-hand look. Hey everybody, so this is a little video. Just wanted to show you a very important mineral that we have here called calcite. So calcite is it has this formula, CaCO3, calcium carbonate, and it can be a mineral, either calcite or aragonite. Actually, honestly, a lot of marine organisms make their shells out of this mineral, aragonite, but calcite's common as well. So these are actually what you see right here are pieces of the mineral calcite. I just want to show you this. So this is right here some, I hope you can see this okay. So this is actually some HCl. It's hydrochloric acid. So I'm going to take a little bit of this acid. This is a really important concept. It comes up a lot in our class. So I'm going to take some of this acid, and actually you can hear and watch what happens. Okay, I'm going to put some of this acid on the calcite. So you can hear the bubbling, right? And you can probably see the bubbling. So you could see that it's reacting vigorously with the acid. Okay. So there you are. All right, now, like I said, a lot of marine organisms make their shells out of this stuff. So here are some shells, and I could put a drop here, and you notice the same thing, right? It's reacting very vigorously with the acid. So, you know, the main takeaway here is that marine organisms, they make their shells out of carbonate, calcium carbonate, and they're very susceptible to erosion and destruction by acid. Okay, so that's the main point here. Okay, so besides the marine shells that you know and love, there's also ones that are kind of like microscopic. So actually, I should say there's a lot of it that's microscopic. So believe it or not, the ocean water, every drop of ocean water is filled, I mean filled, with all sorts of microorganisms. And a lot of those microorganisms actually have little shells that we call tests, T-E-S-T-S, just like tests, like an exam. So you spell it the same way. Those tests, those little microorganisms shells, can actually become sediment over time. So if you think about this, sediment is just any loose material that's settled onto the seafloor, right? So in this case, it could be shells, tests, along with rocks and minerals and stuff like that. So the vast majority of organic sediment comes from the shells of microscopic marine organisms. So the huge amount of life, the vast majority of life in the ocean is actually microscopic, right? It's all this floating plankton, microscopic plankton that have these little tests and shells, and they settle on the seashore or on the sea floor. So you can have shells and tests. You can have rocks and minerals. You can have volcanic ash. That can be sediment. You could also have, for example, because you know the volcanic ash goes way up into the air. It can be blown out over the sea, and it can be settled down into the ocean, become sediment. You have black smokers. We already talked about black smokers that, remember, they are precipitating all of these, like especially iron-rich compounds. That's what the smoke is, right? It's made of like iron hydroxide, iron sulfide, all these like iron-rich minerals that precipitate and they settle on the seafloor, okay? In places where you have really high salt contents, like the Dead Sea, even the salt, the ocean water can get so super saturated that even the salt precipitates out, and you get these salt deposits like you see in the picture here. Now, of course, these things are just entirely grains of sediment, right? Just can settle on the seafloor, and you even have in. Let's see if this. Oh, there we go. So I want to make sure this video works. So, you know, there's so much material in the settling out of the seafloor, settling out of the ocean water onto the seafloor, that you actually get what this phenomenon known as marine snow. So I want to show you this video. It's kind of interesting. So let's see if it actually plays. Yeah, there you go. So you can see all this like snow falling, right? It looks like snow. What is all that? It's all just the bodies of marine organisms or sediment that's slowly drifting down and falling out of the ocean column of water above and falling down onto the ocean floor and becoming sediment, okay? So all the sediment slowly drifting down to the ocean bottom almost looks like slowly, gently falling snow, right? So we call that marine snow, but it's really just ocean sediment, okay? So anyway, so there are two ways actually classifying sediment. So number 3 asks you, what are the 2 ways of classifying sediment? So we can classify sediment and organize and categorize sediment by the size of the grains, or we can classify and organize it by the source of the sediment, or the kind of like the type of sediment. So we're going to talk about those 2 ways, okay? So the size and the source. The size and the source. First thing we'll cover is the size. So, you can have sediment of all different kinds of sizes. Now, it could be anything from boulders to cobbles to pebbles, and then you get down to things that are very familiar like sand, right? And when you get further out into the ocean, you get things like silt and clay. Now, one of the things that you're going to see is that the further out to sea you get, the finer and finer the sediment becomes. So usually you only find things like boulders or cobbles or pebbles or sand. Any of that stuff, you only find that basically in near shore environments. As you get further out and further out and further out, the material gets finer and finer and finer. Okay, so why is that? We're going to cover that in just a moment. So just to give you a little bit of idea about these things, y'all know what sand is, right? You know what different kinds of sand is. Anything that's bigger, pieces that are bigger than 2 millimeters. A millimeter is maybe like the thickness of your pencil lead. Anything that's thicker than maybe like 2 millimeters, we're going to classify that as like a pebble or gravel or something like that. But anyway, stuff that you can't see with the naked eye is either going to be silt or clay. So you can't see silt or clay with the naked eye. Silt feels a little bit grittier than clay, but clay is kind of like the very, 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 very small, basically microscopic pieces of sediment. Okay. All right. So one of the questions here, what are some of the ways that sediment ends up in the ocean? Like, how does sediment get brought to the ocean? Well, assuming that this sediment doesn't start off in the ocean, right? It's external to the ocean, because a lot of sediment is actually something called authigenic. I don't actually have that on the slide, but I can write it up here. Authigenic. What does authigenic mean? Authigenic means self-generating. So authigenic refers to sediment that was originated from the ocean itself. So what could authigenic sediment be? It could be things like shells, marine organism tests. It could be things like the sediment that originated from mid-ocean ridges or precipitates out of the ocean water. Those could all be like authigenic sources of sediment. But assuming it's not authigenic, that it's coming from outside sources, what are some ways of bringing sediment into the oceans from outside, from the continents or elsewhere? So how do you get sediment into the oceans? Well, there are a lot of familiar ways. Like, you might just guess that rivers have something to do with it, and you would be right? So rivers bring sediment right into the oceans. They carry all the sediment away, the sand and silt and clay, and they bring it into the oceans when they reach like a delta. Wind can also do it too. And another thing that probably you'd never thought of before is stuff like ice, like glaciers. So glaciers actually move, they actually flow. This is a time-lapse video of a glacier moving over the period of like 15 years. So you can see that they are in fact flowing, and they do in fact bring sediment into the ocean, because glaciers are actually highly erosive. They're able to erode, destroy, carve out the land surface that they're in contact with. They pick up sediment as they flow, and they flow into the ocean and deposit it. Okay. Of course, you know, like river deltas can do it too. Wind can do this too. You know how you probably heard of things like this. Like a lot of you suffer during the summer from Saharan dust. You know that there's a certain time of year that the Saharan dust gets over here to Texas, and it makes people like cough and wheeze and stuff like that. And normally that dust gets blown off the sand dunes, right, and it gets deposited into the ocean, but sometimes it gets carried all the way over here to North America as well. Okay, so wind, water, ice, those are the main ways that sediment can be brought from the continents and wind up in the ocean. All right, now as sediment is transported. As it's transported and bumped along, whether by the wind or the water or the ice, it gets broken down more and more and more. Think about a rock tumbler. If you had a rock tumbler, the longer you leave your rocks in a rock tumbler spinning and spinning and spinning, the smaller those pieces are going to get. They're going to get broken up and broken up and broken up. Okay? So what ends up happening is that because the continents are the source of a lot of the sediment, the closer you are to the continent, the larger the pieces, right? But as they get transported further and further away from the source, they get broken up and they become smaller and smaller and smaller till they get brought out into the ocean. And the further out that you go into the ocean, the smaller the pieces get. There's also a really important thing about that we need to talk about regarding energy of the environment. So it has to do with energy in the environment as well. So the main idea though here is that as sediment gets transported from the continents into the oceans, you know, when you're near shore, I'm sure you've all been to the beach, and you see that you go to the beach, you go to like the Padre Island or Whitecap Beach or whatever, or you know, you're going to find sand. Okay, and that's what you find at the beach usually, right? Now, if you were to go out really far off the coast, you were going to the deep water, you would find not sand anymore. You'd actually find things like silt and clay. And when you get really deep water, you get like clay only. Okay, so another thing that has to do with this phenomenon of seeing a progression of getting smaller and smaller grain sizes as you get away from shore, it has to do with the energy of the environment. What does energy of the environment is? What does that mean? It means with like how tumultuous the water is near the ocean floor. So in a shallow environment, you know that the ocean floor in a shallow environment, by definition, the ocean floor is very close to the water level, right? That's why it's shallow. Well, you know, the near shore in the shallow water, the ocean floor is constantly being stirred up by all the waves and all the currents and the tides and all this stuff. There's a lot of energy. And so this constantly moving water, the like splashing water, right? And waves crashing on the beach, it's stirring up the sediment on the ocean floor. And what happens is that only the large pieces of sediment can settle out. The stuff like silt and clay take a long time to settle. Okay. So I do want to kind of cut again to a little video and just show you just kind of give you a demonstration of what I mean by this. Hi everybody, so I'm just recording a little video here to show you a little bit about how sediment settles out. So this thing that I have right here is a column of pipe, clear pipe, that's filled with different sediment sizes. So there's clay in here, there's gravel, there's sand, there's all sorts of stuff. So what I can do is I can shake this up, and it's just kind of like the high energy environment, right? And as I let it settle, it becomes like a lower energy environment. And what you'll notice is that, hopefully you can see this on the camera, but you'll see that at the bottom, the first stuff to settle out is like the gravel. And then on top of that is sand. Now, you can see that the water is really murky here, and that's because it's full of silt and clay. So if you gave it some time, it takes time to settle, eventually it would look like this. So you could see that there's gravel on the bottom, there's sand on top of that, and there's really fine clay on top of that, and then the water's relatively clear above it. Okay, this becomes really important in the next lecture when we talk about turbidites, because there's a lot how we get graded bedding with turbidites as well. Okay, so that's a high energy. You see different energies of environment and how they affect grain sizes and the rate at which they settle out. Okay. Now, if you go to a beach like this, you can see that sometimes you have beaches where there's like cobbles and stuff like that, like pebbles. We don't really have beaches like this in Corpus Christi. Now, take a look at this picture. Now, I just said we don't have beaches like this with cobbles and like big rocks, right? At in Corpus Christi or really anywhere along the Texas coast. So just looking at this picture, what do you see here that maybe explains that? What do you see here that, like, looking at this beach, you know immediately this isn't Texas, this isn't Corpus Christi? How do you know? Why is it what's different? And hopefully what you see is something like this. You see there are mountains here. Okay, so what that means is that the fact there are mountains, you know, there are no real mountains here on the Texas coast. Places like California, Oregon, Washington, there are, but not here in Texas. So the fact that there are these high mountains and cliffs, that's the source of all this sediment. That those rocks don't get transported very far. The cliffs are literally the source of that sediment. So because they don't get transported very far, they're really big. They didn't get broken and transported and bumped along and smushed into smaller and smaller pieces, okay? So finer grained sediment usually gets carried further out into the ocean, usually. Okay, so they go into slower moving, stiller water, okay? Sorry, I had to like turn off my email because it kept dinging at me. So I paused the lecture. But anyway, so finer grained sediment gets carried out further and further by ocean currents into slower moving, stiller water. So let me try to, well, come on, let's go. But you know, that's not the whole story, right? Because you can have mud and clay near shore, right? And you know that here in Corpus Christi because you know that there are back bays and things like this. You've probably seen pictures of people like, or maybe you've been like this before, wading through mud in the back bays, in the tidal flats and estuaries here in Corpus. But you know, these protected backwaters. So there's the bays, right, that are protected by the island, right, Padre Island. They're protected by Padre Island, and they're protected from a lot of the wave action. And so those back bays and estuaries, they have a lower energy of the environment because there's less action, there's less waves, there's less tidal flow, there's less current, and it allows the mud and crud and the small little particles to settle out. Okay, so I hope all this stuff makes sense. There's a big interplay between like what affects the size of the sediment. Well, it's the energy of the environment, and it's also how far it's been transported. You know, now here in Texas, we have Texas coast, we have relatively fine grained sediment because the source of the sediment is really far away. We don't have any mountains that are very close to us, right? In fact, a lot of the sediments may be coming from the hill country and you know, even further than that. Okay, so the sediment gets brought here. It's been transported really far. It's small. And then places where we have these backwater estuaries that are protected from the wave action by the barrier island, Padre Barrier, you know, the Padre Island, it's a barrier island. It allows that stuff to settle out, and you get these like clay and mud type areas, okay? So slow moving water, still water, that equals lower energy, and it equals fine grains, okay? So in terms of deposition, what does energy of the environment refer to? That's what it's asking in your lecture assignment. It refers to the slow moving water. And also the fact that the water, the sediment on the ocean floor in the deep ocean is very far away from the surface where all the waves and all of the excitement and tumult are happening. Okay, so when you go to the ocean floor, there's not much action there in the deep water. You know, there's no waves, there's no tidal flow, there's no current flow. A lot of the current is in the upper. You will see later when we study currents, a lot of the currents are really only affecting the top like 400 meters of the ocean. Once you get down below that, there's very, very, very little water flow. And that allows the sediment to just settle out very slowly. So you get down to the ocean floor, this is what it looks like. You don't see sand, you don't see clay, you don't see cobbles. You see very fine clays and silts and things like that. Okay. All right, so that's the story on sediment according to grain size. Okay. The main idea here is that sediment, when it gets transported, the closer to the source, the larger it will be. But as it gets transported, it breaks down. And as it gets transported further and further from the source, the smaller it gets. The further out into the ocean you get, the smaller the sediment size becomes. Also, energy of the environment is important too. Energy of the environment determines the size of the sediment that is able to settle out. If the energy of the environment is very high and the water is very turbulent near the ocean floor, it stops silt and clay prevents silt and clay from settling out, and it becomes suspended in the water and carried off further. If the energy of the environment is low, it allows silt and clay and fine sediment to settle out. Okay, so now let's go on to sediment classified by source. Okay, so we not only have sediment classified by size, we also have classified by source. So we're going to talk about like different sources of sediment now. Okay, so I'm just looking through the lecture assignment, making sure I hit everything. So what sort of marine environments has high energy, which has low? I already talked about that. What kind of sediment size? What's sediment size generally speaking near shore? We talked about that. What's it like in the deep ocean? Okay, in terms of sediment classified by source, what is terrigenous sediment? So we're going to talk about that at this point. So terrigenous sediment, terra, means earth. So this part of the word terra means earth. Genus, it means like genesis, like the origin. So when we talk about terrigenous sediments, we're talking about sediments from the earth, from the continents. Okay, I know that oceans are obviously part of the earth, but we're talking about part of like the continent earth. Okay, the continent part of earth. So terrigenous sediment is all the stuff that comes from the continents. It gets washed off the continents, and it gets washed off in a variety of ways. So it could be from rivers, right? It could be like this. So here's a picture of the muddy Connecticut River bringing its sediment-laden water into the Long Island Sound, right? And you see all the muddy water mixing with the ocean water, right? It could be from ice, like I said, from glaciers. Glaciers flow, and they're able to pick up sediment, and they're able to transport that sediment into the ocean. And you know that as the glacier calves off, so that it breaks off, we have a special word for that we call calving. As it calves off, it floats off and deposits that sediment deep into the ocean. Okay, we can also have wind carrying dust far out into the deep ocean as well. That's another source of things. It's actually a big source of sediment in the deep middle of the ocean. Okay, is abyssal, what are called abyssal clays. These are wind-blown clays that often come from like desert environments that don't have a lot of vegetation cover. So the vegetation kind of stops dust from being blown and carried off. So places that don't have a lot of vegetation cover, desert environments, produce a lot of these wind-blown dusts. Okay, so that's terrigenous sediment. Could be ice, could be clays, wind-blown clays, could be glacial, carried by glaciers and icebergs, etc., etc., etc. All right. Now, that's terrigenous, but we also have something called biogenous. Okay, biogenous sediment is, again, it's a kind of authigenic. Remember, I put this up before. Authigenic. That means originating in the ocean itself. Okay, authigenic. So authigenic sediments, biogenous sediments, are sediments that originate in the ocean as life, as marine life. So bios, means life. Genus means genesis, origin. So it originates from sea life. Now, what you're seeing right now in front of you, these are all microscopic shells, tests of planktonic organisms. Okay, so the water is just filled with this stuff, and it's just filled with it. And as these little organisms die, their little shells drift to the bottom of the seafloor. So of course, biogenous sediment can consist of the shells that you can see with your eyes, but the vast majority of it you can't see with your eyes. The vast majority of it is microscopic, and it's drifting slowly. These are the skeletons and shells of marine animals and algae and plankton and things like that. Okay. Now you know that the oceans are full of life, right? And as these fish and animals and plankton and all the other stuff die, their bodies are going to sink to the bottom. Plankton, the vast majority of it is microscopic. The vast majority of plankton is microscopic. The vast majority of life in the ocean is microscopic. You don't see it. But this is a microscope image just showing, this drop of ocean water teeming with life. It looks almost, and it's kind of a crazy picture, right? It almost looks like outer space, like Aliens or something like that, or some kind of, Star Wars scene or something. But this is really, if you were planktonic organism, this is be what it looks like in one drop of water, right? All right, so we'll have a whole lecture later on plankton, but just little intro. What is plankton, right? Plankton, actually the word plankton actually shares the same word, the same root as planet. And you might be thinking, what on earth does plankton have to do with the planets? Well, the word actually means wandering or wanderer. So planets, you might know if you're familiar with astronomy, wander through the night sky. They move out of conjunction with the other stars of the heavens. And plankton are kind of the same way. They are wandering. They are just being carried along by the currents, by the wind, by the tides. They don't kind of have their own freedom of mobility. They can't move on their own. They can't swim on their own or crawl on their own. They just get carried by the currents, and wherever the wind blows is where they go. Okay, so they don't have much control over their life. They just go wherever the current takes them. That's plankton. Now, a lot of plankton's microscopic, but some plankton isn't. There's actually is plankton that you can see with the naked eye. Now let's go over some really important types of plankton, because that plankton, there's a lot of different kinds that you have to be familiar with, and this is an introduction. We're gonna talk a lot about plankton in this class. It's just hugely important. But one type that you have to start getting familiar with is called foraminifera. So foraminifera are types of warm water. They're eukaryotic organisms. That means that they have, they're relatively complex compared to bacteria. They have a nucleus, they have organized organelles and things like that. And they also produce a calcium carbonate shell. Now you saw in the video before kind of like what calcium carbonate is about, how it reacts with acid. You saw in that little demonstration that a lot of shells are made out of calcium carbonate, out of calcite. So you saw that stuff. So anyway, these guys make their shells out of calcium carbonate, like a calcite or aragonite type material. Okay, single-celled. But even though it's one cell, it can still make a little shell, which I find very amazing. Okay. Now I want you to notice something. Look at the scale bar here. This guy is around, 300 or 450. What is this thing? This weird unit. It's a micrometer. Okay, remember in the metric system we talked about micrometers? So that's 150. So it's probably like half a micrometer. 500 micrometers across. Okay, so this guy, on the other hand, these are another common type of plankton. These are called coccolithophores. Notice these are a lot smaller. Some of these things are just like 1 micrometer across. I always think these things look like kind of like weird soccer balls or something like that. That's how I kind of remember just how they look. But coccolithophores are a type of, again, warm water, photosynthetic. They do photosynthesis, eukaryotic organism. They produce a calcium carbonate shell. One thing that might surprise you is that chalk, like the chalk you write with, is actually made of these guys. It's made out of coccolithophores. So these guys, when they accumulate enough, they harden into a rock, and it becomes chalk. Okay, and that's what you use to write on the board. Okay, another type are called diatoms or radiolarians. Okay, these guys make their shells not out of calcium carbonate, but out of silica, which is glass. Okay, so glass, like the glass, like window glass or whatever, is made out of silica. It's made of SiO2. So I'll write the formula there. You should write the formula down just so you know it. SiO2. Okay. So that's the formula for glass, like the glass in your cup or the glass in your window or whatever. Okay, so these actually make their little shells out of glass type material. They produce these shells, and they're dominant actually in cooler waters. Another type are called dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates produce their shells out of proteins and organic matter. So they produce a substance called chitin. Chitin, it's spelled Chitin. It's a little bit similar to keratin, which, you know, your fingernails, your hair, like horns, like horned animals, like a, you know, deer, antelope, or whatever, they produce their horns, those hard parts, out of keratin, right? So it's a little bit similar to keratin, but it's different. It's called chitin, and it's actually the same substance that, for example, insects make their exoskeletons out of, and things like that. So dinoflagellates have shells or hard shells made of chitin. They are photosynthetic, and they are dominant in warm waters. Another really cool thing about dinoflagellates is that they actually produce these bioluminescence. So let me show this little movie first, just kind of about plankton. So, you know, unfortunately I don't have like a microscope camera to show you this. So I just got somebody who does in the video they have on YouTube, just to kind of give you an idea what this looks like. You know, this watery world of plankton. Okay, so you can take a look at this and get an idea.
Most plankton are too small to see without a microscope. Only when you zoom in on a water sample can you see just how diverse these creatures are and how many can fit in a small amount of water. Each of the video clips you're about to see shows a small portion of a microscope slide made from a single tiny drop of either fresh water or salt water. They magnify 200 to 1,000 times their actual size. The green things zooming around here in this saltwater sample are a type of algae called tetraselmis. Algae are also called phytoplankton. Like plants, they use the sun's energy to turn carbon dioxide into sugars. This is called photosynthesis. Let's zoom in on this sample to 1,000 times larger than life size. Do you see the clearish creature swimming around with a tetraselmis? That's a single-celled animal called a ciliate. It seems to be too small to eat the algae, so instead it's probably eating bacteria in the water. Ciliates are a type of zooplankton or animal plankton. The creature here is another kind of zooplankton called a rotifer. Like the ciliate you just saw, it doesn't seem to be interested in eating the green tetraselmis cells, so it's likely feeding on bacteria as well. The red-orange dot you see is the eye spot it uses to detect light. Here's a different type of rotifer from a different water sample. See how it's attached itself by its foot to a strand of algae? And yes, in case you're wondering, that tail-like thing really is called a foot, even though it doesn't look like your foot. Like that rotifer, this trumpet-shaped ciliate, called a stentor, has anchored itself to a clump of algae or debris in this freshwater sample. Ciliates are single-celled animals named after the hair-like cilia they have around their bodies. They wave the cilia around their mouth to create a current that sucks in food.
So anyway, I just kind of wanted to give you a flavor of what this looks like and what some of these different creatures look like. Some of them are animals, some of them are algae, some of them are protists. You'll learn more about this as we continue on the class. We talk about marine life towards the end of the class. So, but I'm going to move on from here. I did want to show you some really cool videos of dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates are photosynthetic, and they're also bioluminescent. So it's a type of algae that can create bioluminescence. So looks really neat. You maybe have seen things like this before. So when the water gets perturbed, they actually bioluminesce. So these dolphins are swimming in this bioluminescent water. So it looks really neat, right? So it's in Newport Beach, California. They actually had this too. You might remember if you watched that movie Moana. You might remember that like the grandmother becomes like a manta ray, and then she's swimming around, and it's like glowing along. But that's a real thing, right? So you could see the animals swimming along, causing turbulence in the water, can create that bioluminescence. So, and it's from the dinoflagellates in the water. So, anyway, here's another cool video of a guy surfing, and the waves are doing bioluminescence as he surfs. This is again in San Clemente, California. It's in Southern California, along with Newport Beach. So you can see just as this guy is going, or a girl, I can't tell who it is, but they're glowing as they do that. Wouldn't that be fun? That looks really cool. But anyway, you get the idea, I think. So, once various organisms in the ocean floor die, their bodies sink to the ocean floor, and they become part of the sediment, right? Okay, so that's all for sediment number 1, and I will talk to you next time, and we'll cover sediment number 2. Thanks for watching.